Sal idly sipped the last of his beer while studying the troubled woman at the small table near the corner of the dimly lit tavern. She had the ashen look of someone afraid to nudge whatever problem had brought her in for a drink, and she'd been hunched over a mug of flat brew since some time before he'd walked into Jimmy's place. Sal had just drained his second import, and she hadn't so much as jiggled her drink in all that time. Her left hand was white from the death grip she had on the glass handle. Her right was clawing at the edge of the table, and the foot that still had a running shoe on was tapping out some cadence other than the one that the jazz trio in the back room was embellishing. He went to the bar, ordered 2 beers, and took them to her table. "Excuse me," he said, slipping into the seat across from her, "but it looks like your beer's gone flat. I brought you a fresh one to ignore." He set it down and slid it towards her. When she didn't respond after nearly a minute, he craned around to follow her gaze. She'd been staring at the fright mask that Jimmy'd mounted beside the nasty gash left from a brawl, one that was too good of a story to ever erase the evidence. He turned back towards the woman and tapped the edge of her fresh beer with his fingernail. "If that monster over there is anything like the one that's got you spooked, I'd be happy to fight it off for you. I have seen my share of cretins, if you know what I mean." Something must have gotten through to her, because her left hand relaxed enough for him to pry the dead beer out of it and slip the fresh one in to replace it. "That's better," he said. "Do you want to talk about it?" She blinked a few times and looked him over. Sal wasn't exactly the kind of man you'd expect to offer his services in a contest of strength, but then, ever since the bottom fell out of the economy, he'd been trying his hand at a lot of things. Today he was wearing a blue work shirt, but it was too clean for him to claim solidarity with the people he was playing support for. Being a former design engineer didn't guarantee many interviews these days, but it did give him some credibility as an inspector at a construction project he'd once helped to lay out. "Look," she said unsteadily, "thanks for the beer, Mr. Merino, ma'am. Sal Merino. But the monster I'm worried about isn't—" She stopped, closed her eyes, and hung her head. "Isn't what?" "I don't know what it is, what it will be." Sal thought for a moment and then glanced at the mask again. "Well, wherever it is that's got you spooked, maybe talking about it will help." She stifled a humorless laugh. "I'm not sure I even understand it, and it's my experiment." "An experiment? Listen, if this is going to take a while, I can order us some food. You shouldn't try to drown your problems on an empty stomach. What do you say, Ms. Paula?" "All right, but, no soup, okay? I don't think I could deal with soup right now, or stew." "No soup," he mouthed, yielding to his growing perplexity. After he ordered them each a roast beef, without the au jus, Sal tried to ease her anxiety by telling her a bit about his own monsters, the kind that he guessed were spawned in business school dungeons. By the time their food arrived, he felt that she seemed ready to breach her own story, so he asked about her experiment. "It was hell to get funding for," she said after a few bites. "What I wanted to do fell between the ivory walls of several departments, and each one wanted the others to be responsible for it." "Departments?" "Physics, chemistry, biology, even psychology. The university—" "You're a professor, then?" he interrupted. "No, grad student. In a one-off major I forced on them. Interdepartmental students always give the stewards of traditionalism the willies. Anyway, the idea was to find out whether an unstructured biological substrate could support a self-sustaining network of quantum coherent reactions. Because if it could—" Sal raised both hands and almost choked on his sandwich, trying to get her to stop. Whoa, back up a few light years. I think you're going to have to take that a lot slower. Now, what was that again? In English?" By the time she'd finished both her sandwich and the replacement beer, Paula had explained that something really strange happened when you made a thick enough stew of the sorts of proteins, fats, and so forth that packed living cells, especially the nerves in your brain. According to the outlandish theory she was trying to prove, if those big molecules were packed between 12 and 16 angstroms apart, a scale so small that she had to compare atoms to the condiments on the table, The few water molecules that could squeeze between them could be held in place like a maglev train balanced over the electromagnets in its track. Once that happened, the whole stew would start acting like the internet as far as the electrons in the water's hydrogen atoms were concerned. More importantly, those electrons would bounce around at unimaginable speed, with all sorts of quantum coherence effects that Sal asked her not to even attempt to explain. But the end result was what she was after, because if this panned out, her energized stew would be like a skating rink for reality, and that might answer some of the thorniest questions in all sorts of fields. "Do you mean to tell me," he said, draining the last of his beer, "that a bunch of these probable electrons could be the secret to how a couple of pounds of brain cells can think?" She nodded. "That's what I was trying to prove, yeah. Well, not that it is how we think, but at least a mechanism that could explain a lot of the mysteries." "I can appreciate your excitement then, but something must have gone horribly wrong with your experiment to make you so scared. What happened? Didn't it work?" "Oh, it worked all right," she said. "Once I got the conditions right and the pumps were calibrated to keep them that way." "I don't get it," Sal said, signaling the waitress for refills. "If it worked, then what's the problem? What's the monster you were so worked up about?" Paula's face darkened and her breath grew ragged. "If I am right, if the theory I'm trying to prove was right, then I may have created something in my lab, something without a body, without a soul, something with nothing to do but think. But what does it think? What does it experience?" "This may sound uncomfortably practical, but why don't you just ask it?" She looked away. "I wish I could. I really do. But whatever it is that's thinking, if that's what's happened, doesn't really exist. I mean, that soup I brewed up has no way to communicate. God, all I can think of is what would it be like to be awake in a body that doesn't work? If that stew is really thinking, it must have gone mad. Then why don't you just turn the experiment off?" "How could I do that? That would be murder. And besides, before I left, I saw..." Sal sat back in his chair. "You saw something? What was it? What did you see? Is that what you're so frightened about?" The waitress set a new set of mugs down and scooped up the empties. Paula snatched hers and gulped half of it in a panic. "Before I left the lab," she said, her wide eyes belying the forced calm in her voice, "I saw a wave of structure appear in the tank. Suddenly, out of nowhere." "Meaning?" he prompted her. "Oh, God. Meaning that thing I created, that monster that's thinking without a body, it started to make one. And the longer I leave that experiment running, the more time it'll have to create whatever kind of a body a mad, insubstantial monster thinks it ought to have. My experiment will supply it as much raw materials as it can suck up, as much proteins and lipids and whatever it wants. And we won't know what it's building until either it breaks the quantum coherence that makes it possible for it to think without a body, or someone turns off the experiment. Either way, the thing's idea of itself will stop being a quantum probability, the energy will lose coherence, and whatever state its idea of itself was at right then will become real." She stared at the mask on the wall. "I'm afraid to turn it off, and I'm scared to let it run. I don't know what to do." Sal crossed his arms and thought it through. "Look," he said a few minutes later, "if I understand your choices here, either you kill something that doesn't really exist, since it doesn't yet have that body you think it's scheming, or you let it do whatever it wants for as long as it wants, and then find out whether it's dangerous. If you ask me, and you haven't, I think we ought to go and turn that experiment of yours off, but be ready to kill whatever materializes in the tank if it looks dangerous." She slid her gaze back towards him. "We? Well, yeah. It's not like anyone else is likely to believe you, and if they didn't, you might never get the chance to turn that thing off. So let's go."